Internet horror. We all know it. We all have opinions on it. You might love it. You might hate it. Whatever way you swing, I'm simply here today to go over its history, evolution, and impact. It's very important that the first thing we start with here is the definition I'll be using. When I'm referring to internet horror, this encapsulates projects, videos, and stories that have primarily been created, grown, and shared through the online space. It doesn't necessarily mean that they completely originate online, but for the most part, that's what we'll be going over. Now with the definition out of the way, let's go over the format. I'll be going over different periods of internet history, and throughout it plotting notable instances of internet horror on a timeline, which will show their point of origin as well as their ending or loss of relevance. In cases where an entry has yet to end, their point will simply continue onwards into the future. And if you're watching this years into the future, I'm very sorry that I can't time travel and add 2024's The Schmeglo Files ARG into this video, as I know it was a big hit. But enough about the future, because we're going back to the past, to the non-specific time period of the pre-1990s. Before the 90s, the internet as we know it didn't really exist, as it was in the 90s that the concept of cyberspace began to take form. As a quick history lesson, modern computers have been around for a long time. Like, everything was still in black and white when they were invented, and I think just before that was actual cowboy times. Just as a quick reference, here's what computers looked like back in the 80s. Thing looked straight out of Fallout. The internet itself has had a similarly long, and frankly way too complicated history for this video. All that really needs to be known for this is that it didn't truly go mainstream until the early to mid-90s, when things like browsers, web pages, and other programs were made available to the public by using the internet. The closest we can come to internet horror in this time frame wouldn't really be internet horror, but rather computer horror. This mainly came in the form of various media, such as movies like War Games, Evilspeak, and Terminator, as well as new genres such as cyberpunk beginning to gain popularity. Rather than the internet, most of these told stories that had themes of machines and computers having severe consequences for humanity, or that we would be outright wiped out by them in the future. One of the earliest and most famous examples of computer horror would be with the 1967 short story by Harlan Ellison, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which details a world taken over by a rogue AI, but that's a story for another day. The mid to late 80s actually sparked a short-lived panic called computer phobia. The term is pretty much completely gone in today's world, but back in the 80s people were genuinely scared just to use or interact with computers. This reached a point where actual studies were being conducted just to measure how real of a threat computer phobia was. Really, all you need to take from this time period is that going into the 90s, there wasn't a fear of the internet or anything on it, but rather a fear of computers and what they could become capable of. But, as the internet began entering the mainstream, this quickly died off, and new forms of horror began to emerge. And with that, it's time we move into the dawn of the modern internet, in the 1990s. The 90s. More specifically, 1993 up to 2000, the earliest, wildest era of the internet. I wasn't around during this time, but I find it truly fascinating to look back on in regards to internet content. Although sadly, a majority of stuff from this time period is simply gone or just completely broken, since no one was thinking about or had the means to preserve anything back then. Still, what is there is cool, and it's remarkable that we still have some of these old websites and archives at all. Isn't the internet a wonderful thing? Back on track to the Bone Zone, 1993 marked the release of Mosaic, the first graphical web browser. In relation to this video, this will mark the official starting point in the timeline. And with the start of our timeline, also comes the first and longest running event on the entire thing, being alternate reality games, or ARGs. As a little bit of history, ARGs, or at least projects very similar to ARGs, have existed for decades. They started with books, television dramas, and have now evolved into their modern form. If you don't actually know what an alternate reality game is, it's basically an interactive narrative or series where audience participation can either influence events or simply push the narrative forward. We'll be going over a fair number of them throughout the timeline, so you should get the idea of what they are pretty quickly. Throughout this video, we'll be talking about ARGs that originate or mainly took place online, but none are really worth talking about until the late 90s. So this point is more of an introduction to the concept rather than an actual event. And with that, we'll move on to our next point. This point is more of a formality, and also pure speculation, being that it's likely a ton of really early internet horror is lost to time due to not being archived. And as it's lost media, I can't exactly give any examples. In reality, this point could extend throughout the whole timeline, but this is specifically for all the stuff that came super early on in internet history and never made it past the initial years.
This is not a joke. You are now cursed.
Our first real point in the timeline comes in the form of chain emails. Specifically, and obviously, this is referring to the scary ones, such as ones informing the receiver of a scary ghost that will haunt them in their sleep if they don't send it to 10 other people. Yeah, these were pretty common for a while, and interestingly enough, don't actually originate online. As a fun bit of history, one of the first chain letters was in the 1800s, asking for people to send a dime and to send the letter to 3 others. This letter created a snowball effect that led into what we saw in this entry. Sometime around the mid-2000s, chain emails started dying off, mostly because they ended up being replaced by social media posts saying similar things, like those, "Share this or a monster will kill you," or "Like for Jesus, ignore for hell Satan" posts. Semi-recently, those kind of posts have also become a bit of a meme, with people making parody versions of them saying things like this image to die instantly. And after that, these kinds of posts have pretty much died out, outside of the 50+ demographic. Now with that wrapped up, let's move on. Shock sites. Websites created with the sole purpose of shocking uninformed viewers. Really not a hard concept to grasp. These first popped up in the mid-90s with Broadman.com, a site with the tagline, "Pure Evil" since 1996, which hosted all kinds of messed up content over its lifespan. While these sites aren't necessarily horror, they are without a doubt disturbing, especially back in the day when shock content wasn't as widespread on the internet. I guess it can be argued that these websites are scary in a way things like ARGs simply can't be, being that the majority of content on shock sites is completely real. These sites peaked back in the 90s and 2000s, but lost a lot of relevance once more centralized platforms came into play, like Reddit, LiveLeak, and even YouTube, but also just due to a loss of interest. A handful of these still remain, but I'd recommend steering clear of them. The Blair Witch Project is a 1999 film which was presented as real found footage of a group of people in the woods that got murked by the Blair Witch. This point isn't about the film, but rather the online marketing campaign they did, which very closely resembles modern-day ARGs, and pioneered several concepts in viral marketing. The producers set up a whole webpage, which sadly went down just over a year ago, that expanded the story of the film and set up extra backstory, all while continuing to act as if it was a completely non-fictional thing. There was even some bonus video content on there, which seems to be completely lost, even when using the Wayback Machine to view the website, so sadly I can't show any of the cool footage from it. The site talks about how the 3 main characters disappeared, the mythology of the Blair Witch, and still contains some bonus images for fans of the film, although as I said, any video content is seemingly gone forever. Their effort to portray the film as real events seemed to have paid off a little, with the film bringing in $250 million on a $60,000 budget. But enough about cash money. There's a major disaster approaching, and we need to talk about it.
The world is gonna end at midnight tonight. Y2K.
Y2K? What are you selling, chicken or sex jelly?
Now this one is almost cheating because it really isn't internet horror, but it has everything to do with computers, so I'm counting it. But we'll go over it quickly. So basically, back when they were making computers, they didn't think ahead too much, as most dating systems were programmed to only really use the last 2 digits of a year, so 1900 was indistinguishable from 2000. This sounds small, but in reality the issue could have taken down several infrastructures, but as there were years to fix it, nothing really happened at the turn of the millennium. This didn't stop people from completely freaking out, stockpiling food, guns, and other survival equipment, essentially preparing for an apocalyptic event. Seeing as we don't live in the apocalypse yet, I think you know how this one ended, and as the world has moved out of the 1990s, so will this video. Moving into the 2000s, this is where the internet began to truly hit its stride and put us on the path towards the absolute hellscape we live in today. This era saw the creation and meteoric rise of various social media sites like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and plenty more. This is also when internet horror began to truly boom, thanks mostly to YouTube, but also just due to the ever-increasing amount of people with access to the internet. I mean, by 2006, 70% of adults use the internet, and when compared to the numbers in the 90s, it's night and day. There were simply more people online making content than ever before. This era houses a few of the most important, iconic, and influential creations in the history of internet horror, and the first we'll be going over is one I'm certain 99% of people have heard of, being creepypastas. Creepypastas. We all know them, we all love or hate them. If you're part of the 1% of people watching this who have somehow never heard of creepypastas, the most basic description is that they are essentially internet horror stories. They come in all different shapes and sizes, from things like lost episodes of TV shows, psycho killers, paranormal occurrences, and much, much more. It's arguable that creepypastas started as far back as the 90s and some of those chain emails we talked about, but generally the first real agreed upon creepypasta was with 2001's Ted the Caver, which was posted on Angelfire. The story was written as a blog, which detailed two friends who discovered a small opening in a cave, which led to another cave on the other side. Over a period of time, the two chip away at the hole to make it big enough for them both to enter through. Throughout their time doing this, they encounter a variety of odd occurrences, and when the hole was finally big enough, Ted updated the blog to say that the two would be going through it, and that was the final update to the site. While Ted the Caver was the first, it was far from the most popular, as multiple creepypasta juggernauts came out in the years following, such as Jeff the Killer, The Rake, The Russian Sleep Experiment, and The Smile Dog. Overall, creepypastas have had a huge influence over internet horror for a long while, but after peaking in 2014, they've been on a continual and pretty hard decline. I think the main factor in this was simply oversaturation, as well as people kinda getting over scary stories. It was around the time of their decline that those Reddit, true scary stories, no sleep, started popping up and getting pretty big. Creepypastas aren't exactly dead nowadays, as there's still an audience for them, but they've fallen quite a ways from their 2014 dominance over internet horror, and I honestly don't think they'll ever reach anywhere near those heights again. But with that, we need to back up a bit on the timeline, moving on to one of the first real big internet ARGs. The Beast was an ARG developed in 2001 by Microsoft in order to promote the film AI, Artificial Intelligence. Due to having Microsoft money, the ARG was able to do things that even modern-day ARGs aren't able to do, like having 50 different websites set up, having clues happen at live events and over advertisements, and keeping it all going for months. Since it was in general just a big ad campaign for the movie, I won't go into plot details, but it needs to be stated that this ARG was one of the most influential ARGs ever created. And if you're wondering why Microsoft was behind it, and not the film's producers, the ARG was actually supposed to lead into a series of games exclusive to Xbox, but I don't think this ever came to fruition. Around the mid-2000s, a trend started occurring around the same time that YouTube started gaining traction, where various games, videos, and animations would end in a screamer. This sparked a wave of videos where unsuspecting viewers would get jump scared and would do wacky things like punch the monitor, jump out of their chair, or just scream. The two biggest examples would be the Scary Maze game, which released in 2004, which incentivized players to get up close to their monitors for higher precision, and then jump scared you, as well as the video Ghost Car from 2005, which is a car driving down a road, and then a creepy creature pops up and screams into the camera. The Ghost Car video was actually the very first screamer ever uploaded to YouTube, and is overall one of the oldest videos on the entire website. Overall, this was a very innocent and simple trend in internet horror, and it simply died out after a few years, as other things became more relevant. The early days of YouTube were an explosion of creativity coming from various creators across the globe. It was a new and innovative platform to let anyone post whatever they wanted. And for a ton of people, that meant posting their own horror content. Really, there's so many unique and iconic videos from this period that it would be near impossible to list them all. And sadly, many have also been deleted or removed. Some of the heavy hitters of the era would be things like Salad Fingers, I Feel Fantastic, Username 666, Agamemnon Counterpart, Mariano Mortigard Glesgorv, Dining Room Where There Is Nothing, Hi Walter, I Got a New Girlfriend Today, and many, many more. While not many of these are all that relevant today, at the very least they're remembered very fondly. As an important note for where we are in the timeline, Sometime around 2006 or 7 is when the term creepypasta was officially coined by 4chan. I guess now would also be a good time to mention that the name originates from creepy being combined with copypasta, which essentially just means copy-pasted stories. There's nothing more to this one, but it is important to mention that these stories really didn't have an actual name until the mid-2000s. First created in 2007 on 4chan's X-Paranormal board, the SCP Foundation is one of the longest-lasting entries on the entire timeline. After its initial story on 4chan, a standalone wiki was created in 2008, which houses all current SCP stories. As for what it actually is, the SCP Foundation is a made-up organization that houses all kinds of anomalous, unexplainable, or extremely dangerous artifacts, beings, and objects. It isn't limited to that though, as there are a ton of completely original SCPs that would require entire explanations for you just to get a grasp on them. SCP entries are broken down into 4 main classes. First off is safe SCPs. These are anomalous entities that are otherwise completely harmless. Next is Euclid SCPs, which require a decent effort to maintain, and could pose a risk if let loose. Thirdly is the most dangerous of the bunch, being Keter SCPs. These are potentially world-ending entities that need to be contained at all costs. If they can't be contained, then they need to be suppressed or neutralized. And if they are neutralized, they would fall under the neutralized class. With the rundown out of the way, let's go over a few of the notable stories. SCP-173 is one of, if not the most iconic SCP ever created. In short, it's a statue that will attempt to kill anything, if no one has direct line of sight with it, and it does so incredibly fast. Doing as little as blinking, even for a quarter of a second, would likely result in your neck being snapped. SCP-087 is simply an infinite staircase, which has a few anomalous properties within it, such as a face which frequently appears from the shadows. Descending the staircase often drives people mad. SCP-682 is basically just an invincible alligator. SCP-096 is a being that's known as the Shy Guy. Looking at its face, whether in person, in a photo, over video, or by any other means, for any amount of time, seeing any amount of it will cause it to beeline towards you, and it will not stop until you're dead. SCP-3008 is an infinitely spanning IKEA, so just a regular IKEA. And to wrap it up, SCP-049 is a plague doctor who cures patients by essentially turning them into zombies. While the stories did gain some amount of traction near the start, I have my doubts that SCP would be anywhere near as big as it is today without the games. You see, since SCP is an amalgamation of community projects and stories, everything is completely Creative Commons, meaning anyone can make anything with the name. In 2012, someone had the bright idea to make a game out of it, with the release of SCP-087. The game is essentially a playable version of what I described earlier. You descend an infinite staircase, occasionally running into creepy faces. This game actually massively took off within the Tuber Let's Play genre, which we'll be talking about later, and propelled the franchise to new heights. This wasn't the only release in 2012, however, as the absolute heavy hitter SCP Containment Breach came out just after, which is still popular even today. The game had you playing as a D-class personnel, which are death row prisoners sent in to do the dirty work. After a containment breach, you're left to escape an SCP facility, which is full of various SCP entities which could help you, or more likely try to kill you. The years after release saw plenty of updates to the game, but surprisingly, no other major SCP games were released for a few years until 2017's SCP Secret Laboratory, which is basically an expanded multiplayer version of Containment Breach. There's been a decent selection of other games released since 2012, alongside those mentioned before, but these are the ones I find to be responsible for massive periods of growth for the franchise. There's not too much more to say about the SCP Foundation. It's a massive effort with a thriving community, with people writing new stories, making audio commentaries, and full video adaptations of existing stories. If you're an aspiring writer or storyteller, anyone is free to join the fun and create a brand new story for the website, so look into that if you've somehow never heard of the Foundation. With that said and done, I don't want to spend too much time on this one, so we'll be moving on. Say, what do you know? Heavy hitter after heavy hitter. 2009 saw the initial creation of the Slender Man, one of Internet Horror's definitive mascots. The creation came about when the Something Awful forums held a small competition asking for participants to create a scary modern myth. Eric Knudsen, under the pseudonym Victor Surge on the website, posted 2 Photoshop pictures of a figure lurking behind groups of children, the caption stating that they'd gone missing. Of course, we now know this figure to be the Slender Man. We'll be coming back to the Slender Man, as his story does not end here. But no major traction came to the character until 2 specific events occurred, one of which is the next point. Marble Hornets was an ARG created in 2009 that was heavily inspired by the Slender Man mythos. Posted just 10 days after the initial images dropped on Something Awful, Marble Hornets is a multi-season long ARG that even had a movie produced, and because of that, it would take way too long to recap it here. It's important to note that the Slender Man in this series was their own take on the character, even having a different name, going by the Operator. The series lasted for 113 entries and side videos, with the main channel having over 114 million views as of recording. Overall, this series pushed homemade ARGs into the mainstream, and inspired dozens of other projects in the years following, making it one of the most influential ARGs ever created. This is all on top of the project boosting the Slender Man's popularity, but the character didn't truly peak until a bit into the future. With that said, we'll wrap back to that later on. Moving on to the final era we'll be covering, the 2010s are certainly a fun period of horror to look back on. Like the 2000s, a ton of varied and unique content arose during this period, with some of it becoming absolutely massive, and some even becoming truly mainstream. This is the first era where you're going to see things become actual movies, merchandise, or proper franchises. This era has spawned a lot of mainstay names, but also a bunch of fads that would be impossible to mention. As there's just so much to talk about already, this section will primarily be focusing on big events during this time period. In the future, I may make a deep dive video on each era, going into detail with more obscure topics, but for now we'll start with a seemingly small, but in reality pretty big event. We're going to start off the 2010s with a bit of a silly entry, but it's also too iconic not to mention. In August of 2010, an odd post popped up on 4chan's Xboard with the story that a strange figure appeared in their Minecraft world, which stalked them and placed various different objects and structures around the world. In the post, they included the image shown here, which is the first depiction of Herobrine, and the look that's stuck around since then, being a stock Minecraft Steve with the exception of having pure white eyes. Also included in the post was the author saying that they had tried to post this on the Minecraft forums, but they were deleted by a user named Herobrine. When the author looked into this, he said it was the name of Notch's dead brother, and from there, the story becomes increasingly bullshit as Notch never even had a brother. With that said though, stories over the coming year about encounters with the figure propelled him to such heights that the developers of Minecraft, Mojang, included various references and straight up mentions of the character, with an iconic long-running gag in the patch notes being that they removed Herobrine, although sadly, they seem to have retired this joke in more recent updates, marking the end of an era. This one is a bit of an unconventional point, as there's no real beginning to Let's Plays, as technically, they've been around for as long as people had access to recording their screens, which includes going as far back as VHS tapes. Along with that, these aren't really an original form of content or like a thing, but rather a medium in which a lot of horror projects got exposed to the masses. This is really on here to highlight the massive boom of Let's Plays during the early 2010s, along with their fall off over time. Now this doesn't just include horror, although that was a significant percentage of them, as this was likely boosted by the rise of Minecraft during the same time period, along with other games in general. With that said, it can't be overstated how massive Let's Plays were in introducing a lot of people to things like horror games. As let's be real, Let's Plays were primarily aimed at kids. A couple of the major players that gained their followings in this era were channels like PewDiePie and Markiplier, although there were many, many more than that, with many still going strong today, and many more than that fading into obscurity. In July of 2011, a strange, creepy short film was uploaded to YouTube named Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared. The short was about a group of puppets being encouraged to be creative, but are then scolded when they don't get creative properly. I'd recommend giving it a watch, as it's only 3 minutes long, and it spawned a whole series, including a TV show. This is on here, as it's an example of an internet-originating series transcending the platform, and managing to make it onto actual TV, which is a rarity on YouTube. We talked earlier about the rise of Let's Plays. Well, here's a game that pretty much created what I like to call tuber horror, which are games specifically appealing to Let's Players and YouTubers. Slender the 8 Pages was a massive freeware indie game that came out of nowhere, which gained most of its popularity through the hundreds of YouTubers who covered it. The game is simple, having you explore a dark forest in search of 8 pages, with the Slender Man stalking you and progressively aggressing relative to the amount of papers you've collected. It really is that simple, but that didn't mean it wasn't effective. The game was so popular on release that the host website crashed due to the traffic being driven to it. This popularity definitely didn't go unnoticed, as over the years, hundreds, potentially thousands, of Slender clones have been released, with most being pretty garbage asset flips. These are still released to this day, and while they've certainly slowed down, I don't think there ever will be an end, since it's such a basic concept and so easy to do. It's also worth mentioning the game Slender the Arrival, which is essentially a take on the 8 pages by a full studio, which has more of an actual plot, more locations, and more enemies. It isn't very good, and clearly was just trying to cash in on the hype, but still, worth mentioning. It made quite a splash online when it was dropped, as obviously Let's Players flocked to it, but it was pretty much forgotten about within a few months. To end off the Slender talk fully for this video, 2014 pretty much marked the soft end of Slender. People continue to make things past it, sure, but after 2014, the mood around Slender Man was different. This sounds like it's leading into a joke, but it isn't, as in 2014, 2 girls baited another girl into the woods and attempted to take her life, saying that it was to appease the Slender Man. If you've somehow avoided the case, I can at least tell you that the girl did survive and made a full recovery, and that's all I want to go into detail on with this part, and from that, I hope you can see why after 2014, the series faded away. With that said though, 2014 marked the release of another game which kind of blew this one out of the water, but we'll get to that in just a bit. Back in 2012, when creepypastas were at a high point, a little story called Sonic.exe dropped onto the wiki. The story was about a guy named Tom, a big fan of Sonic the Hedgehog, receiving a creepy haunted CD from his buddy, who told him to destroy it. He ignores his plea for destruction like a true Sigma, and plays the game contained on the CD, Sonic.exe. In the game, everything is
hellish,
with
satanic
imagery, and
blood
all over the place. You play as a bunch of classic Sonic characters who are all killed by the iconic Hog, but with hyper-realistic, bloody eyes. The story spawned a few sequels, but was ultimately removed from the Creepypasta wiki for being laughably bad. The author of the story had a calm and rational response to the situation, saying,
"I deeply regret to inform you all that I received some bad news. The admins of the Creepypasta wiki have finally decided to delete Sonic.exe off of the wiki, on the grounds that it was badly written and had too many cliches, and was a bad example of what should be a creepypasta. Bull freaking horseshit. As you can see, I am furious with the fact that my masterpiece, which has won the hearts of millions and has made a massive impact on the internet, is being brought down by a bunch of jealous, arrogant, furry haters. But that does not mean I am just going to sit down and take this lightly. Nope. Nope. Nope, 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 nope. They have been messing with the bull, and now they've called out the horns. Listen, everyone, I need your help with this. We are at war here. I want every Sonic.exe fan who is reading this to get the word out. I want you to tell every other Sonic.exe fan out there, every fanatic, every artist, every follower of my creation about this. Tell your friends who are also Sonic.exe fans if they have to. Tell them that we have to keep the spirit of Sonic.exe alive. Make more fan art, make more videos, block the haters, praise Sonic.exe like you never have before. Build websites dedicated to his greatness. Whatever you gotta do to keep him alive and strong, just do it. The deletion of Sonic.exe from the wiki is but a minor cut on our flower of greatness, my friends. And that cut has done nothing but further the spreading. And we are the pollen of this flower. We need to prepare for our victory over the haters. The haters need to bleed for their crimes. Rejoice, my fellow Sonic.exe fans. Our glorious little hellspawn shall have the laugh yet. This will be his ultimate victory. The absolute subjugation of the internet itself.
Alongside the story came a few games, all of which were adaptations of the story with varying degrees of polish and accuracy. These were also big in the tuber sphere during the time. One odd thing, a very A very odd thing I came across while digging up some history for this one is that nearly 10 years after the original creation of the story, searching the term Sonic.exe peaked to a number which is magnitudes higher than what it was around its initial posting. Now, I'm fairly certain this is due to Friday Night Funkin' mods using the character, as they garner millions of views, but I find it crazy that it surpassed its initial fame nearly 10 years later, while being such a shit story. I guess it really comes down to character design, as evil, black-eyed Sonic is just edgy enough where people are into it. But that's enough trash talk, it's time to continue. August 8th, 2014. A small indie game drops online called Five Nights at Freddy's. The game is about a security guard watching over a pizza place which houses 4 animatronics that move around at night. Within months, it's the biggest name in the gaming space, and has continued to remain relevant over the years, with the most recent release being in December of 2021, Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. It'd be hard to do this one justice, not only because it's such a big franchise, but because it also has a huge fan base that creates original content such as games, stories, and videos. And on top of this, there's books, an upcoming movie, upcoming games, and overall the plot is a very convoluted mess. To keep this one relatively short, since, I mean, come on, everyone knows at least the basics of FNAF, the series has a bunch of games, all with a very similar gameplay style. Usually, you're sat in a location, unable to move as haunted animatronics come to kill you. The only ones that drastically change this up are Security Breach, which is a free roam take on the series, Five Nights at Freddy's World, which was a weird JRPG self-aware parody of the series, and Pizzeria Simulator, which on top of the usual gameplay, has a management simulator. The real results of Five Nights at Freddy's popularity, though, was lighting the fuse for an indie horror explosion. Over the next few years, a ton of games came and went trying to match the same marketability and appeal that FNAF had, with none being able to capture that same mass audience. These range from garbage tuber horror games to actually decent, fun little horror games. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to call anything out on here, but if you just take a look at indie horror games that were released post Five Nights at Freddy's, it's pretty obvious which ones were trying to appeal to the same demographic. Popularity-wise, nothing has been such a viral phenomenon except for maybe something like Among Us, but that's not really a horror game. With that said though, the series can't last forever, and I suspect that after the movie releases, it'll either rejuvenate the series for a few years, or bomb and leave the franchise in ruin. Only time will tell on that front, and we're just gonna have to wait and see. Oh, and also the creator got ratioed for donating to right-wing politicians, and the backlash caused him to quit the franchise.
We had a good thing, you stupid son of a bitch.
Keeping this one short, in April 2015 the movie Unfriended released, which was a movie that entirely took place on a computer screen. The movie was about a haunted group of friends that are in a Skype call as different spooky things happen to them online and also in real life. The movie sucks, don't watch it. It's just worth mentioning because it's a mainstream Hollywood take on internet horror. It had a sequel too, and it actually got better reviews than the first, but I don't actually know anything about it, nor do I care, so we're gonna move on. I don't really have an origin point for this one, but around the mid-2010s, content involving the dark web started to really ramp up. It isn't to a crazy extent like some of the other things on here, but it's worth mentioning. This mainly came in the form of stories, like those of red rooms, black markets, and other messed up websites. Though since it's the dark web, some of it was real, and most of it was bullshit. Just as a bit of history, the darknet has actually existed since 2000, with the release of Freenet, but the first real spike in public interest was in 2015. Overall, this point is in a bit of a gray area, since most of the horror stuff on the dark web is just stories and creepypastas. But there's always a chance that some of it's real, which in a way makes it even scarier.
That's funny. This is funny. I laugh at this.
Analog horror is a recent trend that started popping off in the late 2010s. The genre can be summarized as VHS-styled horror videos, trying to emulate the look of home movies or VHS recordings from the 80s and 90s. People have tried to say that this or that is the first analog horror video, but to be honest, as the genre is just VHS tape-styled horror, I'm going to say that there is no first for this. since that's such a wide-ranging amount of videos. For all we know, there's some proto-analog horror video out there from like 2008 that's simply gone undiscovered. What really popularized the genre though was the series Local 58, created by Chris Straub, who also created a very famous creepypasta called Candle Cove. The series has a bunch of unique videos, with my personal favorite video being Contingency. I'm not spoiling these because they're awesome and worth checking out. One thing with analog horror is, since it isn't an idea and instead an aesthetic, there's both works based on existing properties and completely original concepts. Some examples of things based on existing properties would be things like The Walton Files or FNAF VHS. Both of these things were heavily inspired by, or are literally using, the Five Nights at Freddy's series for their stories, but doing so in ways the games never did. The original works are where things really get crazy, with things like the aforementioned Local 58, the Mandela Catalog, or my personal favorite, the Monument Mythos. Each of these are original works that have spawned entire fan bases of their own, and really drove the medium forward. There's even subgenres of analog horror, usually experimental and one-off, with things like the Nixonverse, which describes itself as analog super horror, combining traditional analog horror with superheroes, creating some of the most buck-nutty videos I've ever seen. To conclude this section, analog horror is far from dead, as new concepts are still being actively cranked out and produced, but in my opinion, unless something major comes along, it's past its prime and will likely fade away over the next few years. But feel free to make fun of me if that prediction is dead wrong. Being popularized around the same time as analog horror, the backrooms are a concept derived from a post on 4chan. The post contained the image seen here, of an empty office-like space, with the text saying that if you no-clip out of reality in the wrong area, you'll fall into an endless space of moist carpet, mono-yellow walls, and fluorescent lights, and that if you hear something moving around, it's definitely heard you first. A scary concept, but nothing too complex. Perfect for the internet to take it and warp it into their own creations. The months following this saw people creating all kinds of takes on the backrooms in all different mediums. There were people treating it like SCP Foundation 2.0, assigning wiki pages for different monsters that roamed around, even coming up with new floors that you could access, which all had different environments. On the other hand, you had the purists, who wanted to keep it as simple as possible, as the horror lied in the endless nothingness you would face if you ended up in the backrooms, rather than what scary monsters you would face. Both have their merits, but neither one is the definitive backrooms, as like SCP, it's a public concept. I'd be hard-pressed not to mention what is widely considered to be one of the best adaptations of the series, Kane Pixel's Backrooms, but they've gotten millions upon millions of views, so I'm not going to go in depth on them. These are 100% worth a watch if you haven't seen them, and you're in any way interested in the backrooms. They've got excellent production value, and are a great middle ground between complete emptiness and SCP 2.0. Similar to analog horror, the backrooms are an ongoing concept, so projects are still coming out, and things are subject to massively changing. But with the backrooms out of the way, a sort of spin-off was derived from them that started picking up steam just a little bit later. Now, despite surging into the mainstream after the popularization of the backrooms, liminal spaces have actually been a concept for a while now. There's books going back decades on the subject. Liminal spaces as we know them now are essentially images of places that are just slightly off enough where they evoke a weird feeling. Typically, they're abandoned or empty places that usually would have things in them. These aren't always horror, but for some people, they're at least unnerving. Due to this though, I'll keep this one short. While they're similar in many ways, there's a clear difference between the backrooms and liminal spaces. One is a hypothetical, never-ending, boring maze, and liminal spaces are typically places you've felt like you've been to before, but something is just ever so slightly off. However, oftentimes backrooms creators take liminal spaces and incorporate their aesthetics into backrooms projects. And if I have to say liminal spaces or backrooms one more time, I'm going to go ballistic. Not really an era, as we're only 2 years in, but I gotta say, the 2020s so far haven't really impressed me in terms of innovation. That's not to say there weren't a bunch of cool projects over the last few years, but they've mainly been riding the coattails of things like analog horror and the backrooms. In this section, I'm just going to list off a bunch of recent smaller horror things that I can think of off the top of my head. This isn't supposed to be a complete list of every project, but rather a few smaller, not worth an entry on their own type of things. Also, a handful of these things cross over into the late 2010s, but I don't care. I'm Sorry John, Gorefield, or rather just Creepy Garfield, is a small community of people creating images of messed up, eldritch versions of Garfield. The community was spawned from posts by William Burke in 2018, but posts involving creepy versions of Garfield go all the way back to 2013. It's also worth mentioning the adaptation by Lumpy Touch, which took inspiration from Burke's drawings and turned them into a fake Game Boy game. I'd recommend checking those out if you haven't seen them, if you've got some time on your hands. Anti-piracy screens were a trend going around for a while, showing off usually fake anti-piracy screens. These usually included threatening or generally unnerving imagery, and that's all there really was to these. Typically, these were made for Nintendo games, with the Mario 64 one in particular being quite popular, made by Super Mario 64 Beta Archive, a channel creating fake beta content for Mario 64. Retro PS1 styled horror games have absolutely popped off within recent years, with numerous games taking on the aesthetic. Along with this, the website itch.io, a platform for indie devs to share their games, started gaining a ton of popularity, as it was a great place to post short indie games. Browsing the website today will find you a near infinite amount of short indie horror games if you're looking for something to play. This one's more on here as a gag since I make them. By the way, check those out. Iceberg videos started getting pretty popular after a Mario 64 iceberg started floating around online, which had all kinds of theories and creepy things on it. Since then, icebergs have taken on numerous forms and are a great way to organize videos, as they usually talk about well-known to completely obscure things in a descending order. On the other hand, some talk about topics in order of how disturbing they are. Overall, I really like these. And more are coming to my channel, don't worry. Siren Head is a creature created by Trevor Henderson, which is, as the name suggests, a very tall creature with a blasting siren for a head. A few adaptations of it have been produced, mainly being short videos with Siren Head edited in, and also a few games have been produced, but they aren't nearly as popular as something like Slender. It's also worth mentioning Trevor's other work, as he cranks out odd monsters and creepy creatures all the time, like it's nobody's business. Definitely check out his art pages if you want to see some cool concepts and designs. Nextbots aren't technically a new thing, but they've completely overtaken the Garry's Mod community for the last few years. In essence, they are PNGs that chase you around, and that's really it. For some reason, these are massive, and a ton of people in the community hate them for clogging up the workshop, as they're so easy to produce. There's been a few ARGs using TikTok as a platform, but that really isn't anything groundbreaking. They're worth a mention though, since I imagine it'd be pretty hard to keep a dedicated audience on an app like that. Over the past couple of years, a bunch of video game-centered ARGs started popping up across YouTube. Usually these have to do with lost beta builds, weird occurrences in games, or uncovering old footage off a previously lost hard drive. Usually they do this through editing and rendering the videos in old Windows Movie Maker copies, leaving the videos feeling straight out of the early 2010s. Channels like Gunslinger Pro 2009 pretend to have old videos that are just now resurfacing, involving haunted or self-aware copies of their respective games. I expect this type of ARG and video style to really start popping off in the near future, as people pivot away from analog horror into this new type of horror, which instead parodies the late 2000s to the early 2010s, rather than the 80s and 90s. I mean, let's be completely real here for a moment. A good chunk of people making analog horror stuff weren't even around for when VHS was still in use. And with that, we conclude the Internet Horror Timeline. I'm sorry if I missed anything on here, but I simply couldn't have gone over every single internet horror thing that ever existed. If enough people are into this, I'd be willing to do the era deep dives I mentioned earlier, or even just doing timelines on other topics. With that wrapped up, for a general channel update, part 4 of the big iceberg I'm working on is underway, and should be out within the next few weeks. It's by far the biggest on the whole thing, with over 200 entries, so clear your schedule before you watch it. After that, I've got another non-iceberg, non-timeline video that I've been wanting to make for a while, so stick around for that because it'll be really interesting. But enough updates for future stuff. I gotta thank you fellas for the support. You guys have been great and very kind in the comments, and I'm going to start trying to get these videos out a little bit faster now, so stay tuned. And hit that iconic notification bell. Thanks for watching. I have to return some videotapes.